A 17-year-old girl vanishes from an ordinary house on an ordinary street in Warrington. 9 years pass. No body is properly explained, no arrest sticks, and the people who eventually go to prison for her murder are not strangers. They are not distant relatives. They are the two people who raised her, fed her, and were supposed to protect her more than anyone else on earth. This is the story of Shafilea Ahmed, a bright, ambitious teenager who wanted nothing more than to live a normal life, and whose own parents decided that her desire for that ordinary life was something worth killing her for. Shafilea Ahmed was born on the 14th of July, 1986, in Bradford, and moved with her parents, Iftikhar and Farzana Ahmed, to the Great Sankey area of Warrington in Cheshire while she was still a small child. To the outside world, this looked like an unremarkable British-Pakistani family settling into an unremarkable English suburb. Shafilea made friends at school. She worked hard. She did well in her GCSEs, well enough that she had already set her sights on staying in education through to A levels, with a clear, specific goal in mind. She wanted to study law. She wanted, in other words, exactly what any bright, driven teenager in Britain might want for her own future. But inside that house on Liverpool Road, a very different story was unfolding, one that had nothing to do with GCSEs or ambition, and everything to do with control. Shafilea's father, Iftikhar, had not always lived the way he came to live by the time his daughter was a teenager. Before his marriage to Farzana, he had, by some accounts, enjoyed a life more comfortably blended with Western culture around him. But something changed after he married Farzana. He distanced himself from that earlier life almost entirely. And when Farzana became pregnant with a daughter, Iftikhar made his intentions for that child chillingly clear in advance, telling a former partner that if he and Farzana had a girl, he would not allow her to grow up without strict Islamic guidance. That was the framework Shafilea was born into, and it was a framework that would tighten around her, year by year, until it finally suffocated her. How does it get to that point? How does a child born into an ordinary house on an ordinary Warrington street end up, years later, dead on a riverbank 2 counties away? It doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens slowly, one restriction at a time, one punishment at a time, until a teenage girl is living a life that looks nothing like the lives of the friends sitting next to her in class. We don't know every detail of what happened behind that front door in the years before 2003. Families like this one rarely leave a public record of the smaller, everyday moments of control. What we do know comes largely from what emerged later in court, and from Shafilea's own actions that speak louder than any private conversation ever could. By her mid-teens, the pressure inside that house had become severe enough that Shafilea did something most people never have to consider doing to their own parents. In February of 2003, she ran away from home entirely. She contacted social services herself. She described herself as homeless. She asked, as a teenager still legally a child, for help finding somewhere else to live. Anywhere else. And Warrington Borough Council placed her in emergency hotel accommodation while they worked out what to do with a girl who had decided that living with her own parents was less safe than living alone in a hotel room. Think about that for a moment. A 17-year-old girl, doing well at school, dreaming of a law degree, chose to walk away from her own family home and sleep in emergency accommodation rather than continue living under her parents' roof. Whatever was happening inside that house, it was serious enough that a teenage girl judged herself safer as a homeless minor than as a daughter living at home. And it did not stop there. Later that same year, her parents took her to Pakistan. According to the account that would later emerge, Shafilea was drugged before the trip. Once there, the true purpose of the journey became clear. Her parents intended to force her into marriage. Shafilea fought back the only way she felt she had left. She swallowed a caustic substance, drinking bleach in a desperate act of self-harm that seriously damaged her own esophagus, injuring herself severely enough that she required urgent medical attention. It was not a cry for attention. It was a 17-year-old girl telling her own body and everyone around her that she would rather risk permanently damaging herself than accept the marriage her parents were trying to impose on her. She remained in Pakistan afterward, slowly recovering, while her parents returned to the United Kingdom without her, leaving her behind with extended family as she continued to get sicker. Eventually, Shafilea made it back to England. And here is the part of this story that makes it almost unbearable. She tried again. In September of 2003, only weeks after everything she had just survived, Shafilea enrolled at a local college to resume her studies. She was trying, one more time, to build the ordinary life she had always wanted. The law degree, the qualifications, the future that had nothing to do with forced marriage or family control. A week later, she was dead. On the 11th of September 2003, Shafilea Ahmed disappeared from her family home. She was not reported missing immediately by her parents. It was a teacher, someone from the very college she had just enrolled in to try to reclaim her future, who eventually reported her missing a full week after she had already vanished. Her own parents did not raise the alarm. The people who were supposed to notice her absence first, who were supposed to be desperate with worry, said nothing for days, while their daughter's body lay somewhere they alone knew about. 5 months. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. For 5 months, Shafilea Ahmed's name was circulating as a missing teenager. Posters, appeals, a teacher who had raised the alarm, a family that, on the surface, appeared to simply be waiting for news like everyone else. Meanwhile, the two people who knew exactly where she was, and exactly why she would never be found alive, went about their daily routines. They didn't crack. They didn't confess. They didn't slip up in some interview and give the game away. They simply waited, the same way any parent whose child had genuinely run away might wait, betting that time and distance would do the rest. It would take 5 months for the outside world to find her. It wasn't a detective who finally found her. It wasn't a forensic breakthrough or a tip-off that cracked the case open. It was pure, ordinary chance. In February of 2004, workmen came across decomposed human remains on the banks of the River Kent, near Sedgwick in Cumbria, more than 70 miles from the Warrington home Shafilea had vanished from. Men doing an unrelated job, on an unrelated day, stumbled onto the end of a 5-month mystery simply because they happened to be working in the wrong place at the right time. The remains were so badly decomposed that investigators could not immediately identify a cause of death. It would take her own jewelry and her dental records to formally confirm what everyone following the case already feared: this was Shafilea Ahmed. 2 separate post-mortem examinations failed to conclusively determine exactly how she had died, the body having been left exposed to the elements for so long that the precise physical evidence of her final moments had been badly compromised. But pathologists were able to determine that she had most likely been strangled or suffocated, and in 2008, a South Cumbria coroner formally recorded a verdict of unlawful killing, stating plainly that he believed Shafilea had probably been murdered. At her inquest, the picture that emerged of who she had actually been was almost unbearable to hear. A bright, intelligent young woman who had wanted nothing more than to go to university and become a lawyer, found dead on a riverbank because of exactly that desire for an ordinary future. And yet, for years, no one was charged. Iftikhar and Farzana Ahmed were first arrested in December 2003 on suspicion of kidnapping their own daughter in the earliest days after her disappearance became public. But in June of 2004, the Crown Prosecution Service released them without charge, ruling that there was insufficient evidence to proceed. The two people investigators suspected most walked free, back into the same house on Liverpool Road, back into their ordinary lives for years. They were arrested again in 2010 on suspicion of murder this time, and released once more on police bail while the investigation continued. It was not until years later, through evidence that had been sitting inside the family itself the entire time, that the case finally, definitively broke open. The breakthrough came from someone who had been in that house the whole time, Shafilea's own younger sister. 7 years after Shafilea's death, she told police something that changed everything. She said she had seen it happen. She told investigators that she had witnessed her own parents commit the murder of her sister, an eyewitness account from inside the family itself, describing a killing that, according to what would later be presented in court, both of Shafilea's parents had carried out jointly, together in front of her 4 younger siblings. According to the case prosecutors eventually built, Shafilea Ahmed was suffocated with a plastic bag, held down and killed by both her mother and her father acting in concert, while her own brothers and sisters, some of them very young children at the time, watched it happen. After her death, her body was disposed of, and the family simply carried on. They went about their ordinary business as though nothing had happened, living inside the same house, continuing their daily lives, while their daughter lay dead somewhere they alone knew for 5 months, until strangers found her by chance on a riverbank in Cumbria. Iftikhar Ahmed and Farzana Ahmed were finally charged with their daughter's murder and appeared at Halton Magistrates' Court, later standing trial at Chester Crown Court. They pleaded not guilty. Both of them, throughout the entire process, from their initial arrest in 2003 through to the trial nearly a decade later, denied any involvement whatsoever in their own daughter's death. The prosecution's case rested on a devastating central argument, that Iftikhar and Farzana had killed their daughter because, in their eyes, she had brought shame on the family. Not through any crime, not through any act of violence or dishonesty, through her refusal to accept the marriage they had tried to force upon her, through her insistence on staying in education, through her simple, persistent desire to live the kind of ordinary life that any British teenager might want for herself. The trial exposed, in front of a jury and the watching public, the full architecture of coercive control that had defined Shafilea's short life. The running away and the emergency housing placement in early 2003. The drugging and the forced trip to Pakistan, the attempted forced marriage. Shafilea's own desperate act of self-harm in response, her return to England, her attempt to resume her education just 1 week before she died, and finally, the eyewitness testimony of her own sister describing exactly how their parents had taken her life. Picture the courtroom itself for a second. 2 defendants, sitting side by side, a married couple who had spent nearly a decade insisting, publicly and repeatedly, that they had nothing to do with their own daughter's death. And across from them, testimony from their own remaining child, describing exactly how that death had happened. This wasn't a case built on circumstantial evidence pieced together by forensic scientists years after the fact. This was a case built on a living witness, someone who had been in the room, someone who had grown up in the years since carrying that memory, and who now had to stand up and say it out loud, in front of the 2 people who had raised her, in front of a jury, in front of the world. Defense lawyers for Iftikhar and Farzana Ahmed had to somehow counter that testimony. They had to give the jury some reason to doubt the account of a family member who had no obvious motive to lie, who had nothing to gain personally from sending her own parents to prison for the rest of their lives, and who would by definition be tearing her own family apart forever by testifying against them. It didn't work. The jury believed her. The jury at Chester Crown Court delivered its verdict, guilty on both counts, against both parents. Mr. Justice Roderick Evans sentenced Iftikhar and Farzana Ahmed each to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 25 years to serve before either could be considered for parole. Detective Superintendent Geraint Jones of Cheshire Police, speaking after the verdict, described the killing in blunt, unflinching terms, calling it a vile and disgraceful act. He explained plainly what had actually driven two parents to kill their own child, that the abuse Shafilea suffered throughout her short life had been motivated entirely by her parents' desire to control her, to force her to conform to their own interpretation of Pakistani culture, regardless of what that meant for her own life, her own future, or ultimately her own survival. Shafilea's friends, speaking after the verdict, described her not as a victim defined by the manner of her death, but as the person she had actually been, extremely ambitious, and a great person to be around. Two of her closest friends, Melissa Powner and Kat Moore, said simply that they had needed justice, and that the verdict finally gave them some measure of comfort after 9 years of uncertainty about whether the truth would ever come out at all. What makes this case so profoundly disturbing is not simply the brutality of the killing itself, but everything that surrounded it. A teenage girl who tried, again and again, through every method available to her, to escape a fate her own parents had decided for her before she was even born. She ran away and asked strangers for help. She injured herself rather than accept a forced marriage. She went back to college one final time, 1 week before her death, still trying to build the ordinary future she had always wanted. Every single one of those attempts to save her own life ultimately failed, not because she lacked courage, but because the people closest to her, the two people who were supposed to protect her above all others, had already decided that her survival was less important than their own sense of control. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Shafilea's case is not rare. Between 2010 and 2014 alone, UK police forces recorded more than 11,000 cases of honor-based crime. 11,000. That's not 11,000 murders, but it's 11,000 documented instances of families using control, threats, abduction, or violence to enforce their own version of honor onto someone, usually a daughter. Usually because she wanted something as simple as choosing her own partner, her own education, her own future. And that number is very likely an undercount. Campaigners who work directly with survivors believe the real figure is significantly higher, because so much of this abuse happens entirely inside the home, inside families where the victim has no one outside to turn to, no neighbor who would believe them, no relative willing to intervene against their own community's expectations. Ask yourself, how many other Shafileas are out there right now? Not dead yet. Just trapped. Just quietly being suffocated, in her own words, by the very people who are supposed to love them. That's not a rhetorical flourish. Those were Shafilea's own words, recorded by people who knew her before she died. She told someone, at some point before her death, I'd rather I was dead, because she felt she was being suffocated by her own family. She said that. And then, months later, that is exactly how she died. Jasvinder Sangira knows this world better than almost anyone else in Britain. She's the founder of Karma Nirvana, a charity that has spent years supporting victims of honor-based abuse and forced marriage, working with women who are living through exactly what Shafilea lived through, right now, today, in towns across the country. She said that cases like Shafilea's deserve to be remembered specifically because the people who killed them tried to erase them completely, tried to make sure their names, their ambitions, their entire existence would simply vanish along with their bodies. Today, the 14th of July, Shafalea's own birthday, has become the National Day of Remembrance for victims of honor-based abuse in the United Kingdom, a date chosen specifically to keep her memory and the memory of others like her from ever being forgotten. Between 2010 and 2014 alone, UK police forces recorded more than 11,000 cases of honor-based crime, acts committed to defend a family's supposed honor or reputation, ranging from emotional abuse and forced abduction to beatings and, in the most extreme cases, murder. Campaigners believe the true number of honor killings in Britain is likely far higher than official figures suggest, hidden within families and communities where victims often have nowhere safe to turn. Jasvinder Sangera, founder of the charity Karma Nirvana, which supports victims of honor-based abuse and forced marriage, has spoken about the importance of honoring people like Shafilea as, in her words, the most honorable human beings, precisely because their own killers tried to erase them completely, to remove not just their lives but their stories, their ambitions, their futures, as though none of it had ever mattered. Shafilea Ahmed wanted to become a lawyer. She wanted to go to university. She wanted, more than anything, simply to live a normal life, the same ordinary future that millions of other British teenagers take for granted every single day. Her own parents took that future from her, deliberately, calculately, in front of her own younger siblings, and then carried on with their lives as though nothing had happened, for 9 long years, until a sister's courage and a jury's verdict finally gave Shafilea the only thing left that anyone could still give her: the truth, and the certainty that the people responsible for her death would spend the rest of their own lives behind bars. Let's go back to that 9-year gap, because it is one of the most damning parts of this entire story. Police had their suspects from almost the very beginning. Iftikhar and Farzana Ahmed were arrested within months of Shafilea's disappearance, back in December 2003, on suspicion of kidnapping their own daughter. At that point, no one yet knew for certain that she was dead. Her body would not be found for another 2 months. But investigators already had enough concern about this specific family, about this specific set of parents, to take them into custody almost immediately. Then, in June 2004, that first attempt at accountability collapsed. The Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the evidence and ruled there simply wasn't enough to charge them. Iftikhar and Farzana walked free. They went home. Back to Liverpool Road. Back to raising their remaining 4 children, the same children who, according to what would later emerge in court, had watched their sister die. Think about what that actually means. For 6 more years, those surviving children lived under the same roof as 2 people they had watched commit murder. Ordinary mornings. School runs. Family dinners. All of it happening inside a house where everyone old enough to remember knew exactly what their parents were capable of, and said nothing, because what else could they do? The case went cold again. Years passed. Shafilea's name faded from headlines. And then, in 2010, police arrested the couple a second time, this time on suspicion of murder itself rather than kidnapping. Released again. Bailed again. Still no charge. It would take one more piece of information to finally break the case wide open, something that had been sitting inside that family the entire time, waiting, in 2010. Shafilea's own younger sister went to police and said the words that would finally end 9 years of silence. She had seen it happen. She described watching her own parents hold her sister down and suffocate her with a plastic bag. She described it happening in front of her and her other siblings, in their own home, on an ordinary day that ended with Shafilea Ahmed dead on the floor of the house she'd grown up in. Imagine the weight of carrying that memory for 7 years before finally speaking it aloud to a police officer. Imagine knowing that speaking it aloud meant testifying against your own mother and father, in open court, potentially sending them to prison for the rest of their lives, while you yourself still had to somehow go on living afterward, carrying both the memory of what you'd witnessed and the fact that you were the one who finally made them pay for it. That single act of testimony is the reason this case did not simply join the long, quiet list of unsolved honor killings in Britain. It is the reason Iftikhar and Farzana Ahmed eventually stood trial at all. The trial itself, when it finally came, forced the jury to sit with details that were almost unbearable to hear in sequence. The running away in February 2003. The emergency housing. The drugging. The trip to Pakistan. The forced marriage attempt. The bleach. The esophagus damage that nearly killed her months before her parents finished the job themselves. The return to England. The college enrollment. One final attempt at an ordinary life. And then, 1 week later, her own sister's account of exactly how it ended, a plastic bag held by both parents in their own family home while the youngest children in the house watched. There is a particular horror specific to this case that sets it apart from so many others, and it lies in the complete inversion of the most basic relationship a child is supposed to have with their parents. We are taught, from the earliest possible age, that our parents are the people who will protect us above anyone else, who will place our safety and our future ahead of almost anything else in their own lives. Shafilea Ahmed's parents did the precise opposite. They placed their own sense of cultural authority, their own need to control her choices, above her actual survival. When she resisted that control, when she asked for help, when she injured herself rather than comply, when she simply tried to go back to school, their response was not to relent. It was to kill her. The 5 months during which Shafilea's body lay undiscovered on a Cumbrian riverbank represent their own quiet, devastating chapter in this story. For those 5 months, her friends, her teachers, and the wider public who had heard of her disappearance were left with nothing but uncertainty, while the two people who knew exactly what had happened to her carried on with their ordinary lives, giving no outward indication of the truth they were hiding. That gap, between what the Ahmed family knew and what the rest of the world was permitted to know, is itself one of the most chilling aspects of the entire case. A silence maintained not for days or weeks, but for years, broken only when one of Shafilea's own siblings finally found the courage to tell the truth. That sibling's testimony deserves particular recognition, because it represents an act of extraordinary bravery carried out under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. To come forward, 7 years after witnessing your own parents kill your sister, to describe that killing in detail to police, knowing it would mean testifying against your own mother and father in open court, is an act that few people could ever be asked to carry out. Without that testimony, it is entirely possible that Iftikhar and Farzana Ahmed might never have faced justice at all, that Shafilea's case might have remained, like so many other honor-based killings, permanently unresolved. Her death recorded only as an unlawful killing, with no one ever held accountable for it. Shafilea Ahmed's story endures today not simply as a criminal case that was eventually solved, but as a stark, necessary reminder of a form of violence that continues to affect families across Britain, hidden behind ordinary front doors on ordinary streets, in households that, to outside neighbors and casual observers, look exactly like anyone else's. She was a bright, ambitious young woman who wanted nothing more than an ordinary life, and she fought, in every way available to a 17-year-old girl, to claim that life for herself. That she was ultimately killed by the very people who should have supported that fight more than anyone else stands as one of the most painful and instructive tragedies in recent British criminal history. A reminder that the greatest danger some young people face does not come from a stranger at all, but from within the very walls that are supposed to keep them safe. Here's a question worth sitting with before we close this out. Shafilea asked for help. Multiple times. In multiple ways. She went to social services herself as a minor and asked to be treated as homeless rather than go back to that house. That is a system working in a small way. Someone did listen. She was placed somewhere else. And then, eventually, she went back. She injured herself badly enough to require serious medical treatment specifically to resist a marriage she didn't want. That is about as loud a warning sign as a teenager can possibly send. And still, months later, she was back in that house, trying to quietly rebuild her education, hoping, it seems, that if she just kept her head down and got on with her studies, things might eventually settle. They didn't settle. She was murdered a week after enrolling in college. Every single person who watches this story is left with the same uncomfortable question. At what point does a system, a school, a neighbor, a social worker, a friend's parent, step in and say, "Enough, this child is not safe here," regardless of what happens to family unity or cultural expectation? In Shafilea's case, that intervention never came in time. It came 9 years too late, in a courtroom at Chester Crown Court, in the form of a guilty verdict that could give her justice, but could never give her back the life she'd fought so hard to keep. That's the story of Shafilea Ahmed. Not just a murder case. Not just an honor-killing statistic. A 17-year-old girl who wanted to be a lawyer, who fought for her own future with everything she had, and who lost that fight to the two people who should have been fighting for her instead. 9 years between her death and their conviction. 5 months between her disappearance and her discovery. One sister's testimony, delivered 7 years after she watched it happen, standing between her parents and freedom forever. Every number in this case represents time that Shafilea Ahmed never got to have. Time she should have spent at university. Time she should have spent training to become the lawyer she wanted to be. Time she should have simply been allowed to live, on her own terms, the way she was trying to the entire time anyone paid close enough attention to notice. She fought for that time until the very end. It's worth remembering her that way, not simply as a case file or a headline, but as a 17-year-old girl who never stopped trying to save her own life, right up until the moment she no longer could. If there is a single takeaway from Shafilea Ahmed's story, it's this: the warning signs were there, visible to anyone paying attention, for years before she died. A daughter who ran away and asked strangers for help rather than go home. A daughter who hurt herself rather than accept a marriage forced on her. A daughter who kept trying, again and again, to simply live an ordinary life, even after everything that had already happened to her. None of those signs, on their own, guaranteed the outcome that eventually came. But together, looking back, they form a picture that is almost impossible to misread. She was telling everyone around her, in every way a teenager can, that she was in danger inside her own home. It simply took far too long, and cost her everything, before anyone with the power to stop it finally listened. That is Shafilea's story, and it is a story worth telling in full, precisely because so many people never get the chance to have theirs told at all. Remember her name. Remember what she wanted for herself. And remember that it took 9 long years for the truth about what happened to her to finally be spoken aloud in a courtroom. 9 years is a long time to wait for the truth, but it finally arrived. And it arrived because one person, finally, refused to stay silent any longer, no matter what it cost her to speak.